So here's a quick 5 pages from Chris Harman's A People's History of the World. When they asked Howard Zinn what he uses for the comparison to his popular People's History of the United States, the People's History of the United States, 48 Laws of Power, Chris Harman's A People's History of the World, those are essentially my 3 holy books, okay? So let's take a look at the Enlightenment. It's only 5 pages. Chapter 3. The most radical intellectual challenge to receive ideas since the rise of class society occurred in the aftermath of the Dutch and English revolutions. The Dutch and English revolutions happens, and then afterwards people are like, maybe we need to change some shit. The more intellectually aware sections of the middle and even the upper classes elsewhere in Europe began to feel that their societies were defective and sought to bring change by changing ideas. This led to a much more far-reaching attack on prejudice and superstition than had occurred in the Renaissance and Reformation. The result was a current of ideas known as the Enlightenment. I think the Enlightenment did not finish what it had started, and so right now we're in the second Enlightenment era. I would also argue that the Gutenberg printing press revolution had a lot to do with it, and the internet is like the Gutenberg printing press revolution multiplied by how many people have the internet. This catch-all category included a range of thinkers and writers, natural scientists, philosophers, satirists, economists, historians, essayists, novelists, political theorists, and even musicians like Mozart. They did not all hold the same set of views. Some had dramatically opposed opinions on major issues. What they shared was a belief in the power of rational understanding based on empirical knowledge. This had to be applied to the world, even if it meant challenging existing myths and established beliefs. Such an approach represented a challenge to many of the institutions and much of the ideology of existing European societies. One influence was that of the philosophers Descartes in France, Spinoza in Holland, and Leibniz in southwestern Germany. They were convinced a complete understanding of the world could be deduced from a few unchallengeable principles of reason, a conviction which grew in the 18th century on the basis of Newton's success in establishing basic laws for physics. These rationalist philosophers were not necessarily political radicals. Leibniz famously declared that the universe ran according to a prearranged harmony, that all is for the best and the best of all possible worlds, a view caricatured brilliantly in Voltaire's Candide. But the rationalist approach could become an almost revolutionary weapon in other hands, since it implied that every institution or practice not deducible from first principles should be rejected. Another influence was a rather different tradition begun by John Locke in England. He insisted that knowledge came not from the innate ideas of the rationalists, but from empirical observation of what already existed. Locke was just as politically conservative as Leibniz. He reflected the attitude of English gentlemen, landowners, and merchants. Their aims had been achieved once English kings agreed to govern through an upper-class parliament. Yet as the 18th century wore on, increasingly radical conclusions were drawn in France and Germany from the English empiricist approach. So Voltaire and Montesquieu in France were great admirers of Locke, drawing from his writings the conclusion that the countries of continental Europe should be reformed along English lines. A conservative doctrine in England could be a subversive one across the channel. The Enlightenment thinkers were not revolutionaries. They were dissident intellectuals who looked to members of the upper class for sponsorship. They placed their hopes not in the overthrow of society, but in its reform, which would be achieved by winning the battle of ideas. Diderot saw no contradiction in visiting the Russian Empress Catherine the Great, nor did Voltaire in collaborating with the Prussian King Frederick the Great. Their milieu is demonstrated by those regularly in attendance at the twice-weekly saloons organized by the Holbach's wife, where thinkers like Diderot, Hume, Rousseau, the future American leader Benjamin Franklin and the radical chemist Joseph Priestley mixed with the ambassador of Naples, Lord Shelburne, the future French royal minister Necker, and the Prince of Brunswick. So that's cool, right? They're essentially having these parties, these saloons that are being held by the Holbach's wife. Voltaire insisted it is not the laborers one should educate, but the good bourgeoisie, the tradesmen. Even the French encyclopedists, who were zealous propagandists of the new thinking, concentrated their efforts on books which were way beyond the financial reach of the bulk of the population. The early editions of Diderot and the Alembert's Encyclopedia in 17 volumes sold only 4,000 copies. Through the saloons of friendly aristocrats or participation in Masonic societies whose secret semi-religious rites brought together the enlightened elite of the upper and middle classes. There are also limits to how far most of the Enlightenment thinkers were prepared to take their critiques of existing institutions and ideas, at least in public. So Voltaire could rage against the superstition of religion, something French maybe, écraser l'infamie, crush the infamy, whatever that phrase means, crush, whatever that phrase is, it means crush the infamy, was Voltaire's slogan, and subject biblical accounts of miracles to devastating critiques. But he was very upset when de Holbach, the apostrophe Holbach, published under a pseudonym a thoroughly atheistic work, The System of Nature. This book has made philosophy execrable in the eyes of the king and the whole of the courts, he wrote. Gibbon in England could write a pioneering history, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, which was scathing in its attack on the influence of the Christian church, but it was not intended to shake the faith of the masses. The Scot David Hume did not punish his own savage attacks on religion during his lifetime. Voltaire objected to what he saw as Rousseau's negative attitude to existing social institutions in the social contract, while Rousseau objected to Voltaire's negative attitude towards religion. But however reluctant they were to take a radical stance, the thinkers of the Enlightenment challenged some of the basic props of the societies in which they lived. These were not open to easy reform, and powerful interests saw any questioning as deeply subversive. Many of the thinkers suffered as a result. Voltaire was beaten up by the hired thugs of an aristocrat, endured a spell of imprisonment in the Bastille, and then felt compelled to live away from Paris for many years. Diderot was incarcerated for a period in the fortress of Vincennes near Paris. Rousseau spent the latter part of his life out of reach of the French authorities across the Swiss border, and the plays of Beaumarchais, whose Marriage of Figaro laid the basis for Mozart's opera, were banned in several countries for suggesting that a servant could thwart the intentions of his master. The church could be especially hostile to any questioning of established ideas. In southern Europe, the Counter-Reformation stamped viciously on all opposition until the second half of the 18th century. In Spain, there were 700 cases of auto da fe, the burning alive of heretics, between 1700 and 1746. In France, Protestants could still be sentenced to slavery in the galleys, and 2 Protestants were broken on the wheel before being hanged in Toulouse in 1761 and Abbeville in 1766. By challenging such things, the thinkers raised fundamental questions about how society was organized, even if they shied away from providing complete answers. Voltaire's Candide suggested that no state in Europe could fulfill people's needs. Rousseau began his social contract with the revolutionary idea: man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains, even though he seems to have put little faith in the masses himself. The philosophers de Holbach and Helvetius attempted thoroughgoing materialist analysis of nature and society, which rejected any notion of God. The naturalist Buffon put forward an almost evolutionist theory of animal species and insisted on the unity of the human species, ascribing differences between races to climatic conditions. The Scots Adam Ferguson and Adam Smith saw human society as progressing through stages of hunting, pastoralism, and agriculture, and so laid the basis for a materialist understanding of social development. Between them, the Enlightenment intellectuals went further than anyone ever before in trying to make sense of human beings and human institutions. There was a sense in which their ideas became hegemonic, in that they dominated intellectual discussion right across Europe, everywhere throwing apologists for other views on the defensive. They received a hearing from all those, even at the very top, who wanted the kind of modern, economically successful society they saw in England, as opposed to the antiquated, economically stagnant societies of continental Europe. At various points, governments in Austria, Russia, Portugal, and Poland try to push through certain reforms associated with Enlightenment thought, and so are sometimes called enlightened despots by historians. Between 1759 and 1765, the rulers of Portugal, France, Spain, Naples, and Parma threw out the Jesuits, and under pressure from the Catholic monarchs, the Pope disbanded the order in Europe. So the enlightened despots, the governments of Austria, Russia, Portugal, and Poland, try to push through certain reforms associated with the Enlightenment thought. They're throwing out the Jesuits in Portugal, France, Spain, Naples, Parma between 1759 and 1765, and under pressure from the Catholic monarchs, the Pope disbanded the order in Europe. In France, Turgot, one of the most prominent physiocrat Enlightenment economists, became a minister of Louis XVI in 1774. But in each case, the reforms from above were eventually abandoned. Even enlightened monarchs were unable to implement them in the face of resistance from ruling classes whose wealth depended on residual forms of feudal exploitation. Diderot wrote in the Encyclopedia that its aim was to exchange the general way of thinking, to change the general way of thinking. The Enlightenment thinkers did make a highly successful challenge to the ideas of intellectuals, including ruling class intellectuals, and it was a more far-reaching challenge than that of the Reformation 2 centuries before. By the 1780s, the works of Voltaire and Rousseau did speak to an enormous public, and cheap, often pirated versions of the Encyclopedia sold far more copies than Diderot himself ever intended. It spread through the bourgeoisie of the ancient regime, which is what the French Revolution is going to overthrow, the ancient regime. And a progressive ideology infiltrated the most archaic and eroded segments of the social structure. Yet the Enlightenment thinkers were hardly effective in achieving their goal of reforming society. Voltaire apparently was dispirited when he died in 1778. Kant noted 60 years later that although he was living in the age of enlightenment, the age itself was not enlightened. Changing ideas was not the same as changing society. It would require another cycle of revolutions and civil wars to bring that about. Chapter 4, Slavery and Wage Slavery. The ideas of the Enlightenment did not simply emerge accidentally from the heads of certain thinkers. They were at least a partial reflection of changes taking place in the relations between human beings, change which had gone furthest in Britain and Holland. The central change through the turmoil of the 16th and 17th century was that exchange through the market played an increasingly dominant role in the way people obtained a livelihood. The church might burn heretics, and the Habsburgs' army might sack urban centers opposed to the rule, but popes, emperors, princes, and lords all required cash to finance their efforts. And this meant that even while trying to preserve the old order, they helped spread the market forces, which would ultimately undermine it. This was shown most clearly after the conquest of the Americas. Silver from the American mines was key to financing the armies which backed the Counter-Reformation, but the flow of that silver was part of a new intercontinental network of market relations. Much of it flowed through intermediaries in Northwest Europe and out of China, the East Indies, and India to buy luxury goods. New international shipping routes from Manila to Acapulco, from Veracruz to Seville, from Amsterdam to Batavia, and from Batavia to Canton were beginning to bind people's lives in one part of the world to those of another. The Enlightenment was a recognition in the realms of ideas. This change, okay. So, the Enlightenment were not revolutionaries. They were dissident intellectuals. They would, get the Prussia or, Frederick the Great and Catherine the Great or what have you. They would give these monarchs their attention. They didn't see a contradiction between what they were doing and hanging out with these despots, these monarchs. So they wanted to change society, but they also needed to get a job, so they needed to have somebody that would finance them and, encourage their intellectual pursuits, their figuring, their thoughts, provoking questions. But ultimately, any of the reforms that these enlightened monarchs had instituted from above didn't work. It turns out that more was needed than just an enlightened monarch to make sure that the ruling classes, the wealthy landowners, the bankers, the moneyed interest, the political classes that were above the king. Apparently, there are some people who are above the king. The king was in a position to actually give a shit about other the people and to help the people out, and sometimes a monarch could be good in that sense, and Otto von Bismarck give universal health care, old age pension, and workers' compensation for injured workers. But he did that to stop the onslaught of socialism, so he started these anti-socialist programs, but he turned into the welfare society. So instead of strong working class people taking power over their own lives, the monarch has said, all right, we'll give you money and we'll help you all out. And so sometimes, a monarch could change things, but during the Enlightenment period, they didn't. The Enlightenment ideals essentially failed. We're discussing the ideas. It makes me think of that Rudolf Eichstein's incredible article, which I recorded just to put it out there because it was hard to find online. It was nowhere to be found online. So I, ordered it on Amazon. It was like it had 50-cent label on it, so it's probably been sitting in some bookstore forever. But Rudolf Eichstein, he came out of Nazi Germany, Nazi Austria, and he said, yeah, we did a bad job in fighting fascism. We didn't stand up and defend freedom of speech, freedom of the press, right to assemble. We did not defend our rights and our freedoms well at all. We had a fascist education, and so therefore we were very obedient, and we did as we were told. Whereas the hope of America is a democratic liberal education, which educates everybody to be the best that they can be. Unfortunately, the public education in America is also teaching obedience to authority, blind obedience to authority. There are no democratic functions. We don't get in class and respect each other's views, and we're not tolerant of other people's views. We don't speak our views and then defend why we believe those things. We don't work on networks or contacts in our relationships. Ultimately, even in teacher education, you sit on your ass, you kiss the dictator's ass, and you ignore your fellow students. There is no solidarity because that would translate to more powerful unions, more people taking power for themselves. No, they want you to be docile, sit down, shut up, do as you're told. And this is teacher training. In teacher training, you would think that a bunch of would-be teachers could get around in a circle and start teaching each other. And then until the adults can start to teach each other, we will not see progress. We will not see advancement of our democratic ideals. In fact, very much, there isn't much of a democracy here. Our vote is just once every 4 years. It's a tiny bit of vote. It's a flash of democracy, and then we go right back to being the wage slaves of the corporations. So that's not democracy at all. Instant runoff voting. There's a whole bunch of ways that democracy could be increased. Most of the majority of the American public don't even vote. And that's true even more so in Kentucky. So democracy, when the majority of the people don't even vote, that means that our rulers don't have democratic authority. They were not chosen by the people. The people said, fuck this election, I'm not even going to give my time and 2 cents. And that's a major issue. That's a major issue if we truly believe in democratic institutions. If we truly believe that we're the land of the free, home of the brave, then we would have democratic practices, such as getting into a group, making collective decisions, solidarity, loving one another, helping to liberate others, putting wind beneath people's wings, and one for all and all for one. But unfortunately, in a capitalist, cutthroat, blood, Malcolm X says, show me a capitalist and I'll show you a bloodsucker. So you have all these bloodsuckers who just care about their own pockets, their own dollar, their own. And so when I was in the logging mill in Breckinridge County, I saw a bunch of degenerate fucking losers who were just obedient. They killed their souls a long time ago. They kissed the asses of the bosses And when the conversation of unionizing or having collective bargaining or getting better, there was a wall. It was in the wintertime, and this one guy at the very end was just getting blistering cold, and then that position kept on, the people would quit, bring somebody in, and they could never hold anybody in that position. Well, all you needed was a wall. Well, everybody else had walls. Nobody else was getting that cold air blowing right in their faces, but the guy on the end, that nobody gave a shit about him. And so everybody had their stations. They were going to stick with their stations. They saw other people as threat to their little, tiny positions. They were able to figure out, they carved a little life for themselves, and they were very happy with what they had done. They could carve a little bit of life, they could pay their bills, and they could survive. So survival was the key. But to thrive, to do better than what we're actually doing, and even, I had suggested saving some labor costs. But the dictator, the boss, he just wanted to have the authority over everybody. So instead of saving labor, and labor is the most expensive, thing that you got to spend in a business, instead of saving labor costs, he'd rather be boss and make us do all this irrelevant labor. We were having to sweep just a little pile of dirt from one end of the factory all the way to the other end. And it would take 3 hours. We would stop the mill. We weren't producing anything. We were just sweeping. And it took fucking forever to sweep all that shit from one side to the other. And I suggested to have bins. Why don't we just take, our little pile of dirt from one side, put it into a bin, put it into a trash can, and take it to the other side, and the boss wasn't going to have it. He would rather spend, $7 an hour times whatever, 5 or 6 people. So what, that's 35, 42 bucks. An hour for 5 or 6 people, and then times that by 3. So he'd rather pay $120, $130 at the end of every week, instead of just buying a $10, $20, maybe $50 trash can or a bin, one of those on wheels, so people could dump their stuff inside it and go to the other side. So when I looked at the employees, I'm thinking, like, how the fuck do y'all accept this shit? Well, they quit a long time ago, just like Thoreau said, that the mass multitude of people live quiet lives of desperation. They were desperate. They had no sense of self. They had no soul. They sold their soul out a long time ago. They were slaves. They were supposed to be happy slaves, too. So be happy, whistle while you work, and do your damn job and shut the fuck up. Don't bitch about anything. Don't have any criticisms of anything. Don't suggest any ideas. The dictator is a god. He is a monarch, just like the teacher was a god, a monarch who gets all the money, all the power, and then you get some of the scraps. So just be happy and content with your low station in life. And that's the dream of America, this liberal democratic institutions. That's how we're going to carry on America. No, America is failing in this regard. The reason why we were so great, or that people thought we were so great, is because of the hope that we instilled. We weren't great at the time, but there was so much hope for us because we were doing a brand new thing. We were doing democracy. The people got to make their own lives. And because of the lack of, democracy, that's why we have 1 million poor people. That's why people are struggling. That's why there's so much crime and craziness. Donald Trump says more cops, more police, and more fascism, not more solidarity, not more education, not more public works program or social spending to get people up out of poverty, but more fascism to beat people over the head. And with all these crimes, they're killing deaf people. They're shooting children and women and unarmed blacks and whites, white women, old women, young. They keep on doing this shit because that's their function. That's their function. The police force came out of the days of slavery and the days of the Industrial Revolution to break strikes. So the police force were instituted to protect capital, to protect the industrialists and the moneyed interest and all those people who could make those enlightened monarchs back in the days of the Enlightenment sell out their reforms and sell out their enlightened ideas, because shut the fuck up and keep society in its place. And then unfortunately he's about to talk about capitalism as being sort of a subversive event in terms of monarchs and fascism and armies. Capitalism, the making of money, that changes the market forces. In order to wage war, you needed money and cash and capital and reserves, and then you depended on wealthy people to invest in your stuff. Well, if they're going to invest in a war, they're going to want something out of it. So Coke is going to turn into Fanta. Pappy Bush is going to, make his money with the Nazis, and then you're going to have the racketeers, privateers, war profiteers, who are going to try to make the money off the blood of the lower class. And unfortunately, it's the oppressed class who fights all the wars. It's the oppressor class who declares all the wars. And at no point in time do the people actually vote for the wars. It's always the elite who vote for wars because people don't want war. But the elite, they do. And also when it comes to the police might kill one or two people, but ultimately the elite, like your Donald Trumps, they're happy about that. You know, it maintains order. It maintains order, so if you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet, if you got to kill a couple innocent people, it's all right. At least we got a peaceful society that's being run orderly and smoothly, and there's not, you know, vandalism and blowing up and rebellions and what the fuck ever. So that's the most important thing. Order over everything. That's all that fucking matters. Freedom, solidarity, justice, peace, love, all those interests are subordinate in the name of law and order. And that's quite a fucking shame. So I'm excited about this being the second Enlightenment, the second in America. This is the second Enlightenment, so that way maybe the first Enlightenment we could actually fulfill what the first Enlightenment had attempted to do. And there's a lot of good things. I was actually, this is the last point that I'm going to make. I saw this meme that was saying Afghanistan in the 1970s showed a lot of Muslim students in Western clothes and garb, and they're smiling and they were, you know, sort of enjoying a Western life. And then they showed a picture of England, which shows that there are Muslims now with, you know, their burqa over them. And so it's like instead of modernizing Muslim, you know, worlds, instead we're allowing the Muslim worlds to take away our freedom. And that's you know, fuck religion, fuck Christianity, fuck the Hindus, fuck the Buddhists, fuck any religion. Organized religion is just fucking dumb. Spirituality is fine, love and support and peace, all these things are good. But religion, it sounds like the atheists are going to have to lead the new world order. The atheists are going to have to establish a better society based on rational, imperialistic, logical thinking. And that's the only hope that America actually has, is the atheists who are still moral, who still believe in democracy. And hopefully we actually have that chance to reform society. So, Jonathan Masters, August 24th, 2016.